Um, Hello. This is such a honestly, this is such bad timing. Welcome, guys, to a brand new video here on the channel and another F1 debate for you guys, where we're going to be discussing everything from the Chinese Grand Prix. And as you can see, this video is proudly sponsored by the FIA's documentation confirming all of the disqualifications of Scuderia Ferrari. I said in the last F1 debate video that I had a Ferrari shirt on the way. The Ferrari shirt had been delayed and it finally arrived today, the day after Ferrari got a nice double disqualification from the Chinese Grand Prix. So I look like a knob, but I'll tell you what, right? This is genuinely the first, this is completely off topic by the way, but this is the first time, I'm pretty sure, probably ever, that I've gone and bought a shirt that's not a Mercedes F1 shirt. And I'll give you the reasons why. I'm pretty sure I might have said it, but if I didn't, if you enjoyed the video, drop it a like, subscribe if you're new around here as well. And as all these F1 debate videos are always the case, the comment section is completely open. So if you've got any thoughts or opinions that you want to put in the comment section down below, be sure to put them in there. At the end of the day, you're not right and you're not wrong. And I'm not right or I'm not wrong. And then I'm not right or wrong. Well, I am wrong mostly. I am wrong to then correct your opinions in the comments. So put them in there. But the purpose of this is that obviously I will always be a Mercedes F1 team fan. So obviously during the weekend, I was actually quite satisfied, especially with the performance of George Russell. But then I'm also a Lewis Hamilton fan. So I thought I would get myself some Ferrari gear to basically go along and continue my support for Lewis Hamilton. And it all started going really, really well. And then it went really, really bad. Really, really fast. So we're going to get into it though. So first things first, let's kick things off with the race weekend. Pretty much just as a whole, like a sort of a summary of the weekend from the start to finish. It was an okay race weekend. I thought the practice is practice. No one cares. The sprint quali, obviously, I really enjoyed it. It was super close at the front. And I thought it was, just a really epic battle. Obviously, we saw a couple of shocks in qualifying. Obviously, Liam Lawson getting knocked out in Q1. I'm going to do a segment on Liam Lawson when I talk about Red Bull's race weekends, because there's quite a lot I need to discuss about Lawson, and actually quite a lot that I want to defend from Liam Lawson. So we'll talk about that at the same time. But what I wanted to discuss firstly is obviously the qualifying for the sprint. So there was Q1 and Q2, or SQ1 and SQ2, was nothing really like amazingly surprising. Obviously the Lawson Q1 exit is still a surprise regardless. And then going into SQ3, I just loved the whole session because there was genuinely four cars, I would say, that were in pure contention for pole position, because Lewis Hamilton was on it from the minute that the Ferrari team got to the track. Max Verstappen was still really fast in qualifying. The McLarens were obviously hotshot favourites. And then George Russell is still putting in, his amazing quality laps. So there was so much action going on. And I did genuinely have a feeling that Hamilton was wasn't going to get pole, but I genuinely had a feeling that Lewis was going to be very competitive. I was still quite surprised that he got pole position, and it kind of, and I do mean this, kind of showed the SF25 has potential, but I got a segment to come with Ferrari as well. But to see him, to see Piastri not improve on his lap time, to see Hamilton get pole, and then Norris to go ahead and basically muck up his lap, which I know he was fastest in the first sector. He had been all weekend long, even in the main qualifying session. And then in the middle sector, he was slower than Hamilton's middle sector, but I think he was still just fractionally up. And a lot of the drivers were constantly going quicker than Hamilton in the final sector regardless. So it was still very much nip and tuck between the pair of them, or between all of them. And of course, I saw Hamilton cross line and get pole, and I was super, super happy. And then obviously I was watching Max Verstappen's lap unfold, and I was, to be honest, I'll be honest, and again, it comes to the Red Bull segment later, but I didn't really think Verstappen was going to do anything. And then for him to go ahead onto the front row and be, 18 milliseconds behind Hamilton, firstly, I was obviously like, happy that Hamilton got sprint pole, but I was applauding it as well, because I was like, do you know what? It was an epic lap from Verstappen, and I was also applauding just the qualifying session. It was just so close, and I couldn't predict it. From Piastri taking the upper hand and looking like he had a comfortable margin, to Hamilton putting a lap together, to Norris then messing up his lap, to Verstappen putting a lap together. Leclerc and Russell weren't really in sprint qualifying. They didn't really get anything going for them, but they still put in some very competitive laps. And you know what? It was really, really cool. Transpiring then into the sprint race itself, I love the sprint race. I thought the sprint race was brilliant. And it's going to be part... And you know what? We'll put the segment in here. I'm somebody, right, that I'm never really a fan of the sprint format, okay? I just don't... I don't know what it is. I just feel like it's forced entertainment, you know? And there are some good about the sprint format, and there is some bad about the sprint format. Now, the good thing about the sprint format is that you can get better action, because ultimately, you know, we go from one practice session to... Sorry, we go from 3 practice sessions, which, let's be honest, only the nerds like me and other people out there really pay attention to. Where we pay attention to the short runs, we pay attention to the long runs, we delve and dive into the analytics and the delta and the data, and we find out a rough guide and so forth. Versus the fans then, where they get to see one session where the teams rightfully get to practice, and then they get 2 qualifying sessions and 2 Grand Prix. The problem is the majority of the time, the Grand Prix and the qualifyings are consistent repeats of each other. But where I actually back it a bit more now is that the sprint qualifying in the race had a completely different story to the main qualifying in the main race, because the sprint quality in the sprint race was Ferrari versus Red Bull versus McLaren, with Mercedes sort of kind of in there. Going into a main Grand Prix then, where it was McLaren versus Mercedes, where McLaren basically had the edge pretty much the whole race, to be honest, but Mercedes kind of kept themselves in there. Ferrari went completely backwards. Red Bull didn't have the pace at all. And it was quite interesting to see the flip. And, you know, for me, I don't necessarily mind the sprint weekends as long as they do stuff like this where it's different. And I go back to it. I just don't know why the sprint races aren't just reverse gridded for the whole for the whole way through, where you genuinely have one qualifying session. You know, you don't even need 2 qualifying sessions in the sprint weekend. You can get away with just having FP1 and FP2 on a Friday. This is personally what I would do. On a Friday, I'd have FP1 and I'd have FP2. I'd then have qualifying in the morning and this would determine not only the grid for the main Grand Prix on Sunday, but whatever this grid order is on the Sunday, you then reverse the whole grid. The sprint race then is in the afternoon. In that sprint race, it's reverse gridded. And it makes things different. You can't predict the weekend. Like for us, ultimately, we knew exactly what this race weekend was going to produce. You know, we knew exactly the medium tyres were useless. We knew full well, we didn't know anything about the hard tyres, but we could basically see that this was going to be a Grand Prix totally dedicated to how the drivers look after the tyres. And that's another talking point to come to later when I talk a bit more about the race. It's the main race itself. But that's for me how I would rock up a sprint weekend, because FP1 is fine. No problem with that. Then you've got a qualifying for the sprint, and then you've got the sprint, and then you've got another qualifying session, and then you've got a race. And while it brings more entertainment to the fans, there's a lot of new fans out there or people that don't know Formula One, that get really confused like this. For example, I was in work on Friday, right? And Friday morning, the qualifying was underway, you know, in the UK, right? And my boss in work is, you know, one of the most soundest human beings on the planet. And I was watching SQ3 because SQ1 I was watching whilst I was getting ready to go to work. SQ2 I was watching... That sounds really bad now, but SQ2 I had on in the car, but not watching it. And then SQ3 was when I arrived at work, and I was watching it now, the end of SQ2 and SQ3 anyway. And my boss was just sort of like, oh, so he's got, you know, as Lewis Hamilton got pole, because ultimately everyone in my work, there's not massive diehard Formula One fans in there, but they were sort of like, oh, has he got pole? And I was like, yeah, he's got pole, really happy. And he's like, oh, so that's pole for like the main, is that the qualifying for the main race? And I'm like, no, that's just qualifying for the sprint. And it's like, what? So I was like, basically they've got to qualify for the sprint race, then they do a little short race for 19 laps. And then they do another qualifying session to then get the grid order for the main race. And it was just like, for somebody that doesn't really know anything about Formula 1, but knows big drivers like Verstappen, Norris, Leclerc, Hamilton, Verstappen, you know, they know those drivers. They don't understand the whole purpose of the format. And it's just very repetitive. And I just feel like it's a bit, I don't know, just clustered. And, oh, look, ultimately, if you reverse the grids for the sprint race and then issued those points out, you know, will the McLarens go from 20th all the way up till 1st in a sprint race? Probably not in 19 laps, no. But ultimately, what you're going to get is constant battles and action, because the top runners at the back are going to try and race to the front. The drivers at the front are going to be back markers, and they're going to do, for example, right, go to the main race, which was Jack Doohan versus Isaac Hadjar. That was a really heavily defended drive from Jack Doohan with one error, which cost him 10 seconds and penalty points on his license, right? But could you imagine the two of them battling as hard as they did like that, but for the lead in a sprint race? It's the battle for the lead, right? It would just be epic. It would be amazing to be like, these guys are battling to win the reverse grid sprint race here. And the other thing to bear in mind is that because this is reverse grid, you know, we talk about the field spread quite a lot in races. There wouldn't really be a massive one, because the guys at the front that create the field spread, where you've got, you know, 20 plus seconds to Tsunoda, for example, well, they're not there. So you've got the guys at the front who are slower, so it's going to be harder for them to pull away from the guys behind and build a gap. So then the front runners, technically, you know, when they lose, like, you know, you see it on boards, like when, you know, 3 laps have been completed and Hamilton, that's, for example, in Melbourne, was stuck behind Albon. He's already 10 seconds off the lead. Well, he's only going to be, what, like 15 seconds off the lead, down in 16th place, because everyone's right next to each other. I would personally do that for a sprint format weekend, because I just think the way that we've got it is just too confusing. But how I'm trying to bed this into the point is that the sprint weekend this weekend was brilliant, because the entire story of the sprint didn't carbon copy and replicate into the main race, which is what we get pretty much all the time. You know, in the sprint races, even in 2023 or in... What Grand Prix was there? I think it was I want to say it was Baku 2023, Azerbaijan, right? I could be wrong on this one. But Charles Leclerc got pole position in both the sprint qualifying and the main qualifying for that race weekend, right? Then we go to the sprint race, and Leclerc stays in front for a couple of laps. Verstappen blitzes past him. Perez blitzes past him. They absolutely run wild with it, dominate, they win. We then go to the main race, and Leclerc's on pole, and it's like, well, we know he's just going to get blitzed past again. We're not stupid. Whereas we went from the sprint race here, where Hamilton dominated, to the main race, where it was Piastri versus Norris versus Russell, where the Ferraris went backwards, Verstappen went backwards, and it was just 2 separate race stories for a weekend, and it brought variety. So I feel like doing a reverse grid brings the variety. I don't know why I rambled about that, because it was completely irrelevant, I think. But that's kind of what I feel. I just feel like sprints just need to be reverse grid. I personally think so. Just one qualifying session, and then don't open up the Parc Fermé. So you've got Friday FP1 and FP2, but when you get into qualifying, that's all you get. You don't get an FP3 in a new day. You've got your Friday, you make your changes. Qualifying is as it is. You've then got your setup for the sprint race, because ultimately, again, you're not really going to be able to... You can fine-tune bits, obviously, in a sprint race, but again, with the McLarens... I'm just taking these guys into example, but with McLaren, Red Bull, Ferrari, Mercedes all at the back, it's difficult for them to fine-tune it, because they're constantly either racing another car or they're in turbulent air, and they're not in clean air, so they can't get, you know, better data. So it would help. And then in the main race, well, you've already qualified, you know, beforehand anyway, so we know what the grid's going to be. So no issues really, is it? So that's my thoughts on that. But then into the main qualifying session, it was McLaren pretty much fighting each other. Hamilton, I think he said he made a mistake somewhere on his lap. So he said he could have probably been a bit further up. Ultimately, it made no difference because, again, when I talk team to team, it was irrelevant because the Ferrari was just not on the pace. And also they were illegal anyway. Hence why this shirt is just... Wrong side. Hence why this shirt is hilarious because it's just pointless now. I've just decided, let me get something Ferrari related to support Lewis Hamilton. And what do I get in return? A double disqualification. At least my head wasn't fried like the Tifosi were because ultimately, you know, Mercedes had a good weekend. So I got that bit in it. But yeah, so the main qualifying itself was pretty decent. I'll give a massive shout out to props, and I'll say it more in the team-to-team review, but George Russell excelled in that qualifying session and really shocked and surprised me in that one. And in the race, actually, really, really surprised me. So, again, I'm not going to talk too much into that because I feel like, again, team-to-team will go through it. The main race itself, this is the difference. The sprint race was really, really good. You had Hamilton on pole. He led away from the first few laps. There was some battles further behind with Lawson making his way through the field. You had Hamilton pulling out of DRS. Then all of a sudden Verstappen comes into DRS. Then he's putting Hamilton under pressure. Then Piastri's in DRS of Verstappen. Then he's out of it from Verstappen. Then all of a sudden Piastri gets into DRS of Verstappen. The two of them then have a little bit of a battle going up towards turn 1. Then ultimately Piastri does get past Verstappen. George Russell also dived it up the inside of Leclerc on the first lap. Then Leclerc is trying to come back at George Russell on the final lap of the Grand Prix. Hamilton is then all of a sudden not facing Verstappen, but he's facing Piastri. But Hamilton just does his little wave and says, I'm off, I'm out of here. And then dominates the rest of the race. And then all of a sudden, we have the checkered flag. And Lando Norris had a shocking start. Then he couldn't get past Stroll. Eventually he did. But he struggled to catch up to Antonelli, I think it was at the time. But then all of a sudden, as Piastri was overtaken Verstappen, Russell and Leclerc were catching Verstappen but didn't have enough time. And I just feel like, talking about all of that in the race, and there was the crash at the end when Jack Doohan went into the side of Gabriel Bortoleto. I talk about all that in the sprint, and I feel like I could talk about that sprint like I've just done, but then for the main race itself, here's what I genuinely thought. So the lights went out, everybody babysitted their tyres for the first few laps. Leclerc had a front wing damage, they pitted, overtook some back markers. Norris got past Russell at the start. Norris overtook Russell after Russell undercut him, and then they babysitted their tyres a bit more. Ferrari got worse and worse and worse. Hamilton pitted for new tyres. But for some reason, a two-stop was completely pointless and it didn't make a difference. Verstappen passed Leclerc and Piastri won. Norris had brake problems but still stayed second. It was crap. It was an awful race, I'm sorry. It was really, really poor. It's one of my pet peeves with racing, and you're never going to get it the way you want it. Like, ultimately, the biggest issue that I've got with the Pirelli tyre compounds is the thermal degradation, and it's so I swear loads on my channel. I don't have a PG filter. I try and keep it PG for the F1 debate so everybody can freely listen to it, but I can't stand thermal degradation problems with these Pirelli tyre compounds. Now, yes, don't get me wrong, these tyres are going to be hot. The tyres are also going to be cold. There is a tyre temperature. There is a surface temperature and a core temperature. But I am sick and tired of drivers having to babysit their tyres and not race. Like, this is so frustrating. It's like, I saw it on the team radio and it's like, yeah, you know, you can pick up the pace, close up to Piastri, Lando. And it's like, yeah, but if I do that, I'm just going to lose my tyres and then I'll be in the dirty air, so I'll be sliding around and then I'll increase my temperatures and I can't pass. What's the point then? What's the point? You might as well just... It's just the Monaco Grand Prix on a big track. Like, that's all it is. You just can't pass. And it's so... Don't get me wrong. Yeah, of course, when you're in the dirty air of another car, with the fact that the downforce on these cars has increased so much from 2022, because ultimately there's just been no regulation changes, really, between 2022 till now in 2025, I get that there's going to be, you know, the points where, you know, the dirty air is going to be more... it's going to affect the cars more because the more downforce you put on, the more dirty air that you produce, more turbulent air, that you produce. and the more that the car behind you is going to suffer from it. I get it, and I understand that. But I'm just so fed up of these drivers not being able to get the just constantly designing a Formula One car, and the thing that's not working on it is tyres. It's just so annoying. Like, it was the same in qualifying, not qualifying, but it was the same in the Australian Grand Prix, and it's the same now. It's like, oh yeah, this car's really, really good on its tyres, so it's that. And don't get me wrong, it is an element of racing. You can design a car that completely chews up the tyres, like the Haas in 2019. I get that. And you could design a car that's super consistent on the tyres, or you're just a tyre whisperer, in general. But the fact is that I'm constantly talking about these drivers saying it's so hard to get these tyres in the right window, get the tyre temps up, get the tyre temps down, and tyre this, tyre that, and I'm just bored of it. I'm just bored. I don't want the point of Formula One is I don't want it to be about tyres. I want the car to be designed, and I want the car to make the impact. I don't want it to be because of a tyre compound that overheats, or a tyre compound that's degrading. Now, don't get me wrong. You can't have a tyre that grains just like normally and then that's it. Because ultimately, if you design a tyre where the surface temperature is never really a problem and the temperature in the tyres is just consistent, basically you just have a good bloody compound. Because I'll be honest, Pirelli have been shit with their tyres for a long time. But to have, a tyre, you can't really have a tyre where you can just push flat out and it normally degrades, because ultimately, people will still babysit them anyway to try and extend the stint of the tyre life. I get it. But I just wish that they could just alter the compound so that drivers can afford to push more and not give up tyre performance or temperature or anything like that. If you can just do that, then it's fine. I don't mind that. But the fact is you're going 8 seconds a lap slower, and you can't basically put, like Charles Leclerc in a way, basically. He pushed to try and keep the pressure on George Russell, couldn't find a way through because of the dirty air, and then never got close to him ever again. He backed off a little bit and then couldn't get into DRS ever again. And it's like, that's just not fair, is it? It's not really what we want to see. So that's my thoughts on that. But I just thought the main Grand Prix was really poor. Now, don't get me wrong. You're not going to have 24 out of 24 Grand Prix that are going to be absolutely stellar, amazing, and, basically gobsmacking. Like, the Australian Grand Prix was a brilliant race, right? The Chinese Grand Prix was a crap race. Let's just be, I'll be honest about that. If you're a McLaren fan, you're absolutely buzzing. It's a brilliant race. It's a 1-2 finish. You don't care. But obviously, we want to see fighting, all across the grid. And it didn't really happen apart from Ollie Behrman. So shout out to you. But we just didn't really get any of it, did we? So, it's just one of those. You have good races, you have bad races. With that being said, let's go and talk about the teams, though. And I'll give you my thoughts and opinions on all of them. So starting things off with the race-winning constructors, McLaren. They dominated the weekend. Well, I say dominated the weekend. Not really, but give a huge props to Oscar Piastri. He was on top form all weekend long. Practice, he hit the ground running. In sprint qualifying, he qualified third. Did a great job in sprint quali. He out-qualified Norris. He obviously had a decent sprint race. He managed to stay close and to Max and make the move stick, and that's job done. And obviously, in the main qualifying, he got his first pole position in a Grand Prix, which was, massive congratulations to him and a long time coming. And then in the rain race itself, he didn't get an amazing start, but he perfectly boxed in George Russell and then just held off Lando Norris for the whole race, made no mistakes, and put in a properly good performance, which was, for me, a performance. I mean, I saw it in Melbourne anyway, but it was a performance that showed to me that this man can challenge for a world title, because, he's so calm and so composed, and I just love watching him race. I just love his personality. He's just so laid back, and he's so chill, and I'm a massive fan of Piastri. I really am. I love the guy. He's not like that, but you know what I mean. Come on. I think he's a great driver. He's got great personality, and the guy's quick as hell. And ultimately, compare that to Lando Norris. While Norris finished second in the main race and finished, I think, 6th or 7th in the in the sprint race. For me, I thought Norris had a really, really poor weekend. And this is where Piastri capitalised on it. Obviously, practice is practice. But in the sprint qualifying, He was on a pole lap, probably, and he messed up, locked up in the hairpin, and pitted and aborted the lap. You've then got the got the sprint race where he goes wide on the curb and loses like 2 or 3 places. And I don't know how he's managed to do that, because he didn't need to be out there, and he had the space anyway. Maybe he thought he was going to get forced wide, but he had plenty of room, but he obviously made an error there and had a shocking sprint race. Then in the main race itself, he didn't have a great qualifying. He locked up again in the hairpin and messed up and ruined his lap. Then got out-qualified by Russell. In fairness to him, he did get past Russell, but ultimately he just didn't have what it takes in that Grand Prix in particular to challenge and fight Piastri. Whereas, for example, like in Melbourne, I know McLaren told them to drop back and there was differences, with the wet weather and stuff, but when Piastri got past Verstappen, the gap was like 3-4 seconds to Lando Norris, and bit by bit, Piastri came at Norris and then started pressuring him and got into DRS range. Norris couldn't do that to Piastri here in China, and ultimately, Piastri just didn't put a foot wrong. Norris put too many feet wrong, put 3 feet wrong, and that cost him. So, I mean, it's a 1-2 for the team. It was obviously nervy for Lando Norris with the brake pressure problem, or the brake issue. Great work from them. I think it was like 20 laps from the end, or 15 laps from the end, that the brake issue started coming into fruition. And for them to manage that was really, really impressive. And ultimately, they nearly lost one more lap. And Norris probably would have finished, or he would have finished third, but I don't know if he would have finished behind Verstappen in the Red Bull. It was probably a possibility. But yeah, ultimately, super lucky to get the 1-2 in the end because that reliability came into play. But ultimately, the McLaren is the best car. It's going to be really, really hard for teams to beat the McLaren. I think the first phase of when we'll see if anybody can come at McLaren is going to be the Bahrain Grand Prix. Japan, I don't see any people really challenging them around there. I think come Bahrain is when teams will start to bring the first big upgrades of the season because they would have done testing at Bahrain. So they've got all the information, all the data and all the knowledge from Bahrain that they can take into the season, which they're doing, to then bring upgrades to Bahrain. They can get such a perfect data reference between the two. So I think we haven't really seen upgrades yet come in from teams so far. Obviously, McLaren will be bringing their own. So if McLaren have got a great car now and they start upgrading it and it still gets better, we could genuinely be in for a season where we thought it was going to be an epic season to just genuinely a fight between one team. And as long as both drivers are in the championship battle at the end, I couldn't care less, to be honest. And also then, of course, we've got to remember that we have the major technical directive coming in the Spanish Grand Prix where flexi front wings just aren't allowed to happen. So that's going to be something to keep an eye on going forwards. But for now, it's all McLaren, and all they're going to be doing is just taking advantage. Similar to what Verstappen did at the start of the season. They'll just rack up the points now, and then if other teams upgrade and catch them, then upgrade and catch them they shall. We'll go to Red Bull next, because I've got a bit of talking to do about Red Bull. About both their drivers, actually. Overall, it was obviously a 50-50 weekend. Verstappen did Verstappen things, got himself the front row in the sprint, and got P3 in the sprint. And then in the main race itself, Verstappen qualified, I think it was 4th in the end, and then he finished 4th after dropping behind the 2 Ferraris and then passing Leclerc, and Hamilton pitted for a second time and it didn't even work for him anyway. But starting off with Verstappen, Max Verstappen, I think personally anyway, put in an absolutely tremendous weekend. And it's funny to say that because for the entirety of the main Grand Prix now, I agree with David Croft, I didn't even remember him. I forgot that Verstappen was in the race because I'm so used to him being at the front. Like, for example, in Melbourne, where he was just constantly pressurizing the McLarens and being a nuisance. Here in China, the Red Bull just ultimately didn't have the pace to beat McLaren or Mercedes. But Verstappen just is still, despite the car not being the ultimate fastest, probably second, third fastest, sort of split between Mercedes in a way. That guy is just constantly over-delivering on everything. His speed and his talent is carrying that car. Even, when they were winning all their races, in 23 and 24, Max was still carrying the car to places it shouldn't be. And ultimately, I'll be honest, that Red Bull shouldn't be in front of the Mercedes. It shouldn't be in front of the Ferraris, I don't even think. I actually think the Ferrari is a quicker car than the Red Bull. I just think Max is able to do more in the Red Bull right now than, for example, what Lewis and Leclerc can do in the Ferrari, because we know that when the Ferrari is set up right, they're quicker than the Red Bulls, but it's very hard at the moment for Ferrari to set the car up. So it ultimately pegs them back to basically a performance gap behind Red Bull, plus Verstappen's pure pace. Because, I mean, in the sprint, Verstappen couldn't touch Lewis Hamilton. In the main race, Verstappen couldn't touch the two Ferraris until ultimately the Ferraris ruined their tyres, and Verstappen kept his going and kept his consistent and basically took off in the final third of the race. So, but to go into that Chinese Grand Prix, to qualify on the front row, just milliseconds behind Hamilton for pole, to then go into the sprint and then basically at least give Hamilton a run for his money and then fight with the McLaren before dropping back. So then in the main race itself, where again he qualified about a tenth or so off, at less than 2/10 off pole, put in a great lap, to then in the main race, all right, he was quiet in the main race, but ultimately beat the Ferraris. It was an absolutely stellar job in the weekend, and that's why you can just never rule out Max Verstappen. And I still, I'm not a Max Verstappen fan, far from it, but I agree with what me and my dad were having a conversation about in this Grand Prix weekend, is that there is it doesn't matter for me if this is how the season goes all the way now to the end of the season. Oscar Piastri or Lando Norris, for example, if any of them won the World Championship this season, I still would say that they're not as good as a driver as Max Verstappen. And it's not a controversial thing to say, because ultimately, you give the best drivers the quicker car and they'll win. If you put Verstappen, and I know it's the cliche thing to say, right, I get it, but if you put Verstappen in a McLaren, he would go ahead and make that car work and win. If you put Hamilton in that McLaren, he'd make that car work and win. If you put Fernando Alonso in that car and made it work, he will go and win. Because they're just genuine born talent. And that's where I stand with it. But Verstappen had an amazing weekend, absolutely faultless, and I can't credit him enough. That then comes to the flip of Liam Lawson, who had yet another shocking weekend. P20 in both the qualifyings. In the sprint, he made up a couple of places. In the main race, he didn't really do anything. And now there's obviously talk that Liam Lawson will be dropped completely, not just from Red Bull, but out of Formula One by the Japanese Grand Prix next round. Now, if this does genuinely happen, it will be such a stupid thing to do. And you're thinking, well, hang on a minute, what? Is your brain working? Because you've just seen how bad Lawson has been. The problem is, right, let's cut the slack here. This is Liam Lawson's first drive in a Red Bull, okay? He's not actually ever done a full season of Formula One, ever. He's done 2 mini stints in the AlphaTauri and the VCARB, when it was called VCARB. He's never done a full-time Formula One season. He's not classed as they don't say he's a rookie, but he effectively is, in quote, kind of a rookie, right? So he's never done that before. He's only had 1.5 days to test this Red Bull. Now, I know that everybody's had the same amount of time to test their cars, right? That's why Sainz is struggling in the Williams. That's why Hamilton's not quite there yet with the Ferrari, even though he was better than the Leclerc in China, but he was off in Melbourne, and you would go to some other tracks and it'll be the same. So you've got that to play into mind. The next thing to play into mind is that day 3 of pre-season testing, Max Verstappen tested the Red Bull's brand new front nose and front wing. He tested Red Bull's new floor. He then did comparisons between the old front wing to the new front wing, to the old floor to the new floor, to different floors and different front wings. Liam Lawson never tested any of those. In the Australian Grand Prix, Liam Lawson had the old front wing. Now, I don't know if he had the old floor or not, but he had an old spec front wing, effectively. Verstappen had the new front wing and the new floor. So ultimately, Lawson's already at a disadvantage because he's not running those upgrades. Now, yes, Lawson has FP1, 2 and 3 to bed into the Australian Grand Prix and also qualifying, even though he ultimately made an error on his lap. But he then didn't get a chance to race because it was, super slippery conditions. It was wet. The track was slippery. Obviously, there's white lines everywhere. So, you're never going to have any grip. It dried out, and then they were on dry tyres for 2 laps, and then it rained again. So it was ultimately a race where you can't really learn anything apart from how the Red Bull drives in the wet. Then we come to China, and it's a sprint weekend. So he's got 1 hour of practice to kind of learn the car. Then he's got sprint qualifying and then a sprint race, and then a main qualifying and a main race. He just hasn't had, and I completely agree with what Liam Lawson said in the press conference. He doesn't have the time to learn this car, but he needs time to learn the car. And I feel like if you replaced him now at the Japanese Grand Prix with Yuki Tsunoda, Racing Bulls are then trying to snatch up Franco Colapinto on loan from Williams to... Sorry, not Williams, because he's not there anymore. From Alpine to Racing Bulls. It's just... honestly, the Red Bull driver program is a brilliant program. And I mean that, because ultimately, half the grid have come from Red Bull. You know, we remember this. You know, Verstappen's a Red Bull driver. You know, Albon used to be in there. Sainz used to be in there. Vettel, when he was driving, used to be in there. Hadjar's in there at the moment. You know, there's been so many drivers, and I've probably missed some that are on the grid, still racing now, that are part of that program. And to say for Lawson, you've not done a full season, but you're not good enough, bye-bye. To then go, actually, we'll get Franco Colapinto in from Alpine. Remembering, though, that Red Bull specifically rejected getting Colapinto in the first place from his time at Williams. They simply said, nope, we are no longer interested in you. To then go, oh, actually, because Lawson's not doing well, no, we are going to get you in, but we're going to put you in the Racing Bull alongside Hadjar instead. Then we're just going to chuck Tsunoda up, and then a Red Bull genuine driver program driver, we're going to get you gone, and then we're going to put in somebody that's on loan instead. Like, I don't get it. I don't get the Red Bull driver program in many other aspects. It's not right. It's just silly. And I think, for me, I would stick with Lawson. I'd just give the guy some time to understand, because ultimately, Red Bull already know that their car is not the quickest, and it's a very difficult car to drive. Even Verstappen has defended Lawson, being like, I'm not surprised he's struggling all the way down there, because he's never driven a Red Bull car before, and I've driven Red Bull for about 8 seasons, and this thing's a pile of bollocks to drive, you know? So I would genuinely be massively shocked if they swapped the two drivers around. Not even swap them, just drop Lawson. I'd be absolutely stunned if they did. But Red Bull is Red Bull, and Horner and Marco are completely different characters. So we'll have to wait and see on that one. Next up then is the team that I'm obviously deciding to rock for this F1 debate video. It's the Scuderia Ferrari. Jesus Christ, how can you go from so good to so bad so quickly? But hey ho. I just want to give a massive shout out to Sir Lewis Hamilton, the first driver ever in Formula 1 history to secure a race win and get disqualified from another race in the same weekend. If that's not GOAT status, I don't know what is GOAT status. But let's talk about them. So, Ferrari came into the weekend hoping to do a better job than they did in Melbourne, and ultimately they did. It wasn't as brilliant, but they did a better job. Lewis Hamilton was on it in the Chinese Grand Prix weekend. He's always been great around the track, and he got pole position for the sprint, and he won the sprint and dominated it. And then we go to the main race, in the main qualifying in the main race. This is where I don't understand Ferrari and their logic here, okay? So Hamilton specifically said after the Grand Prix that they made changes to the car after the sprint to help with ironing out some issues. And it obviously backfired and it didn't work, because he went from having a really balanced car and a good rear end to having no balance at all and a horrific rear end that he had no grip and confidence with, right? And he also said in the TV pen, and this genuinely shocked me now, that Leclerc tested something in Bahrain, testing. Hamilton hadn't tested it yet, so they went in that direction. What? Like, I don't get it. I actually don't, because you've just seen that you've set your car up in the sprint quali and the sprint race, and you are rapid. Why would you... Now, I say this with a pinch of salt. Why would you change that? Now, ultimately, look, you're going to change it because, you know, there is more performance to find. But why would you then go to something that you did in Bahrain for? What was the point? Because Leclerc had tested it, did Leclerc like that setup? Did it work? And ultimately, you're in a position where you can't really experiment. And I feel like, unfortunately for Ferrari, this massive concept change that they've done is continuing to backfire, because they're the only team out of the top 4 teams that have had a major conceptual change going into this year. McLaren have evolved their car, Mercedes have evolved their car, Red Bull have evolved their car, Ferrari have completely changed their car from the ground up. And I mean, credit to Ferrari in terms of, yeah, they changed the whole car and ultimately it's still a front-running car. But realistically, why would you be experimenting on a setup design going into the weekend? Like, don't get me wrong, F1 is all about performance. And for example, Mercedes, like say 2020 Mercedes or 2023 Red Bull, you know, those times when that car was the absolute fastest and there was nothing anyone could do to touch them, you are still going in there to find more performance because there is more performance to find. So I completely get why why Ferrari and Hamilton went into that and went, let's try and sort this out, let's try and sort that out. But to go into do direction changes which sounded as drastic as that, it just doesn't make sense to me. You know, you had a great car. Why make too many changes? There have been time periods where some teams have literally just not changed anything on the car. Why would you bother? I wouldn't. For me, and I mean, they'll look at it in hindsight and look at it as a learning curve for them, but I wouldn't have changed anything because their tyre wear was better than everybody else's. They had great confidence and pace. Leclerc even went towards Hamilton's setup for the weekend and felt more comfortable. And then all of a sudden in the main race then, it went to pot. And then to make it even worse for Ferrari, they were quicker with a car that had a broken front wing end plate. That's how badly balanced the car was. You know, the fact is that Leclerc and Hamilton were so poor in terms of the setup that if you whack off the front wing end plate and get rid of it, it actually rebalanced the car, which is just mind-boggling and just shows how poor they set it up. To then go into the next point of call. A double disqualification for Ferrari and a double disqualification which was for 2 separate incidences, which is just mind-baff. It just blows my mind. Like, you know what? If you're a Ferrari fan, like I have a soft spot for Ferrari. I always have done, but I'm more invested, should we say, in Ferrari now because of Lewis Hamilton being there. I'll be full frank and honest. Like, I mean, you've seen it. All I've been wearing is Mercedes shirts my entire time. This is the first time I've bought a Ferrari shirt ever, right? And for me, I never really cared too much about Ferrari ever until now because Hamilton's there. I'll be honest with that. You know, when Hamilton retires from Formula 1, I'll still have a little soft spot for Ferrari, but I won't really care about them as much. I'll be honest with you, straight up. But how the hell you can get a disqualification for 2 separate incidences is mental. Obviously, for Charles Leclerc, his was for the weight limit. Obviously, you need to be a minimum of 800 kilograms on the weight. Once you've drained all the fuel out, he was 799. 1 kilogram. Instant disqualification. It's heartbreaking, ultimately, yes. But I think it's quite clear that the Ferraris tried to do a 2-stop race, but then saw that everyone else was doing a 1-stopper. To be honest, I wasn't necessarily massively surprised about Leclerc's disqualification because it was the same as George Russell. I think everybody else had realised a lot earlier that the 1-stop was possible, so just did a better job with that. And I feel like because Leclerc ultimately pushed hard to attack Hamilton in the start of the hard tyre stint, got past him, then pushed hard to attack George Russell, couldn't get past him, despite having a better balance on the car, still had a damaged front wing end plate, which would still hurt the tyre wear. I think he just basically ran to the point where he had no tyres. And I understand where some people maybe say, yeah, but Leclerc had a broken front wing end plate, so that would have made dividends. But ultimately, when it comes to the weight checks that they do after the race, anything that's damaged can be replaced with a like-for-like part. You know, that's the same spec part. So when they did the weight test on Leclerc's car, they would have changed the front wing because ultimately it would have actually been even lighter had they left that front wing on. For Hamilton then, his skid block was 0.4 millimeters had sort of worn and too much basically. And again, well, that's going to be setup related. And that's a worrying one because that's ultimately, you know, the Shanghai track was not a bumpy circuit. It was really grippy and resurfaced, but it was not a bumpy circuit. So for them to have a skid wear infringement is worrying. Where they'll take a bit of confidence is obviously Leclerc didn't have skid block wear. So did Ferrari then, what I'm saying about this, did they experiment with Lewis Hamilton in terms of the setup change and lower the car a little bit more, thus skidding the blocks more. But if you're doing that, and that's where you need to run your car low to get the best out of your car, it's a big, big problem. I think ultimately for Ferrari, it's been a horrible, horrible start to the season for Ferrari. It's been shambolic. It's not over. There's still 22 races to go, but ultimately, they've got to get their act together from the Japanese Grand Prix onwards and start putting in some performances, because if they don't, they're going to get left behind and it's going to be a problem for them. And I can see that the biggest problem with the Ferrari is that it's the rear end. The rear end stability is not there. They're having issues with that part of the car. That's what caught out Haas as well, because Haas take the rear end from Ferrari. They've been struggling, especially in Melbourne, they struggled. So there's some problems there. There is a rumour that Ferrari will be bringing some upgrades to sort this out in Bahrain. But ultimately, this is a key period now for Ferrari. We've had a back-to-back race. We've had a double header, should I say, Australia and China. We've got a 2-week break now. So as per every team on the grid, up and down from McLaren to Sauber, they'll all be analysing into the data. But this is where Ferrari more so need to take more time and care and attention into fine-tuning that car, because when it's quick, when it's optimized, it's rapid. Sprint qualifying and sprint race shows you that. But it's got such a narrow window with a lot of issues. They can't fix it. They're in trouble. And maybe, and again, this could be a thing. It could be a thing. It might not be a thing. Maybe Ferrari's conceptual change has had to take them a step back from where they were last season, but can upgrade them this season and jump 2 steps forwards, and then be, be where McLaren are now, but for a longer stint of the season, close the gap and go from there. I don't know. Mercedes-Benz, they are doing a great job this season. I can't lie to you. George Russell is becoming one of the most consistent drivers on the grid so far this year. That man is just putting in performance after performance after performance. In the sprint race and the sprint quali, he wasn't really there, but ultimately sent up the inside of Leclerc in the sprint race and put in a great job, finished P4. Great effort. Fair play to you. In the qualifying for the main race, that man absolutely triumphs on his final lap, smashes it onto the front row, shocks everyone by doing that, including me. I was like, Jesus Christ, what? And then he goes into the race. All right, he lost out at the start to Lando Norris, but it wasn't as if Russell had a bad start. It was just Russell had a good enough start to put himself into a position where, unfortunately, he was just going to get boxed in by Piastri, and it happens. Mercedes obviously did the undercut, but Norris got back in front of him because the McLaren's just ultimately quicker. And for Russell at the end of that race, on the same strategy to finish 11 seconds off the race win, is a really, really good drive from him, and another podium. Back-to-back podiums now to start the year for George Russell. So, mate, the guy is just super consistent, and it's an excellent effort from Russell. So, the guy's performing. The guy's performing really well. And if Mercedes can get upgrades on that car, then he will be there for the championship. And that's a big thing to say. But that Mercedes, the thing, and it's an easy thing to say, but the thing that Mercedes is lacking is just pure downforce. Is if they can get more downforce on that car without compromising, the setup and the window of everything else, then they've got a challenge on their hands to go for the championship. And unlike Ferrari and Red Bull, McLaren got a 1-2, so yes, the Constructors' Championship took a hit, but Mercedes are keeping themselves alive in the Constructors' Championship better than Red Bull and Ferrari are, to then, if they do get upgrades that work really, really well, to challenge McLaren later on. So, excellent stuff from George Russell. It was a mixed weekend, not really a great one for Kimi Antonelli. He did a good job in the qualifying sections of the weekend. It was just the races that didn't go well. Obviously, sprint quali, I think he got out-qualified by Tsunoda. No, unless Tsunoda passed him. I can't remember. I'm pretty sure Tsunoda out-qualified Antonelli in the sprint. Ultimately, he couldn't get past him in the sprint. Just struggled with the tyres and the dirty air to get past him. Very quiet race from him. Finished below par. In the main race itself, it was a gutting performance from Antonelli. He did a great job. He obviously got past Hadjar at the start. Kept well with Verstappen in the first stint, but ultimately, I didn't actually realise this, but at turn 2, he ran over Charles Leclerc's front wing end plate, and it wasn't too bad for him. But then as soon as he got to turn 3, then it got fully lodged into the floor and then broke the floor, and he lost about 4/10 a lap. So Obviously, he was struggling for pace. He then came out of the pits and lost out to Ocon. Ocon put a great overtake on him and then managed to hold off the Racing Bull for a bit and then came home in a lowly P6. Somehow, again, I loved how he also admitted, like, he got driver of the day and was like, really? I didn't do anything. So why did I get it? But ultimately he did. So yeah, he's still doing a great job, Antonelli. I still think he's got loads and loads of potential. It just wasn't his weekend, ultimately. But to come home and finish in a good point scoring position with floor damage for the whole race, credit to him and credit to the team to help him with that. Mercedes are a dark horse this season. I didn't think they'd be where they were, but they're a dark horse. Let's talk about Aston Martin. It was a great performance from Lance Stroll. Good performance in the sprint. Decent performance again in the race. The qualifying was again pretty decent all round. Alonso has had an absolute nightmare start to the season. He can't catch a break, and it just feels. I feel bad for Fernando Alonso. I can't lie, because I just see a driver there that I know that has it in him to go all the way in a grueling championship battle, and he just hasn't got the machinery to do it, and it is disappointing. I can't lie, but unfortunately, it's the way it goes. You know, brake failure pretty much on the first lap. Just, that's it, gone, bye-bye. And yeah, real shame for Fernando. Not really much to say on that. There's some room to improve on that Aston Martin. They're definitely not as bad as I thought they would be from the first two races. But ultimately, I think there's potential. It's just not being able to be unlocked because of Alonso crashing in Melbourne and Alonso going out. No disrespect to Stroll. He's done a good start. He's had a great start to the season for where they are. But you just know Alonso can pull more out of the car than anyone else, so that's where it stands. Good weekend as well for Williams. Albon definitely the better driver at the moment. Great performance to get into Q3. Just consistent at the moment is Alex Albon. Some issues at the moment for Carlos Sainz. Would I be worried about Sainz and that Williams so far? Not really. No, I think it's a learning curve again, and it's like I was saying about Liam Lawson. It's like I was saying about Lewis Hamilton. Ultimately, Sainz needs to learn the Williams car. You know, it's a completely new powertrain for him. Let's remember that in this V6 turbo hybrid era, Sainz has never driven a Mercedes power unit. So again, as per what Lewis Hamilton's having to do, I mean, also, obviously, he's having to embed himself in a brand new team that he's never been a part of. He's got to, embed himself into a brand new power unit that he's never driven before. All these switches, all these menus, all these things, it all does add up. And no matter how good an experience you are, like, for example, Hamilton, he's got a fully embedded Charles Leclerc that, to be honest, I know the race went a different way, but Hamilton was better in that weekend than Charles Leclerc was, so it'll come for Sainz. It's just going to take him some time. And ultimately, Albon's embedded in that Williams team, and he is super consistent and just playing it well. And I think, the same thing. Give Sainz some time, a couple of races, probably after Jeddah is when, to be honest, anybody that's gone into a new team, I would say after Saudi Arabia, you've got Japan, Bahrain, and Saudi. Once you've done those races, for me, you should be embedded in that team properly. That's kind of how I judge it. So it is what it is. He'll get there, but they're getting super consistent. And I'm pretty sure I saw a stat that said that Williams had already matched the amount of points that they scored from the whole of last season. So credit to them, I guess. Great effort this weekend from Haas. They put a brilliant weekend in. Ocon was so underrated in that race. I actually thought that there was a point when Ocon was in the points that he had to pit again. Turns out he didn't and was just playing a blinder, so fair play to him. And Ollie Behrman, for me, Ollie Behrman was driver of the day. I don't know why it was given to Antonelli, but Behrman started in 17th, fought his way all the way up till P9, P10. Ultimately, the Ferraris got disqualified as well, so some more points there, but Behrman was on a mission. I mean, he was on those hard tyres for a long, long time. Pitted, went onto the mediums, and it was a long stint as well on the medium tyres. We saw everybody pit like between lap 12 and lap 15 from the mediums to a set of hards. And I know the fuel loads would have been different, but Behrman still had a good 20 plus laps to do on those tyres. And we saw in the sprint, and even in the main race, that the mediums were not a good tyre. So for Behrman to then go out there on 20 plus lap mediums and just make loads of overtakes and give everyone a cheeky little chow when he was going through, which I found really funny, was credit to him. He put in a brilliant race, and I thought he was the driver of the day for me, personally. I thought he did a great job. So, I give it to Ollie Behrman. A knock on, yeah, a surprise race because I didn't realise, I wasn't tracking him as much. I didn't realise that he got all the way up till P7, then to P5. So excellent weekend for Haas and a great bounce back for them because Melbourne was a real eye opener. I think there's going to be some tracks where they'll struggle on, especially in high speed cornering. I'm a bit concerned about Japan for them, but maybe again with this little break now of 2 weeks, they can analyze the data and work out what setup options are working, what setup options are not working, and discover the window of their setup, basically. Alpine, super quiet weekend from them. Gasly, decent performance. Obviously, he was the third driver to get disqualified from the Chinese Grand Prix. His was also the same as Charles Leclerc with the weight limit. I don't know what the car came in at in terms of the weight, so don't know about that, but, you know, a big shame for him on that one. I didn't really know much from him from the sprint. Jack Doohan, it was a messy weekend for Jack Doohan. But what he can show is that he's a cracking defensive driver. It's just annoyingly the one time that he did go way over the limit with Isaac Hadjar. But apart from that, the guy's good at defense. The guy's aggressive and he'll get his elbows out and he will race you hard. And I like that from Jack Doohan. But ultimately, it's kind of overshadowed by the fact that he just did have a bad weekend. 2 10-second time penalties. And he's now got more points on his super license than he does World Championship points. Because he has 4 points from this weekend. From his super license, though. And none on there. So, yeah, it was that silly dive bomb on Bortoleto or Hulkenberg, one of the two, in the sprint, which was just never on. And obviously the forcing Hadjar off the track in the main race itself. But it was a quiet weekend from them. Racing Bulls. I'll go on to Sauber, sorry, then we'll do Racing Bulls. Because Sauber, with the same thing, quiet weekend. It is what it is. They're just not up there at the moment in terms of performance. And they couldn't replicate scoring points this time around. It is what it is. Nothing really more to say on the Sauber, to be honest. And then Racing Bulls. That team's strategy decisions needs to be studied. Because holy moly, how can you mess up the strategy on that car 2 races in a row? Because they were on track, they were on court, they probably would have scored a good amount of points so far this season, but they both opted to put their cars on a 2-stop. It completely backfired. They couldn't make their way through the traffic, and then Tsunoda's front wing flap just went, nah, I've had enough. I'm just going to brake. Fair enough. Just brake, and it ruined their weekend. That Racing Bull, this is the problem, and this is what I remember from Sauber last year, because the Sauber car was the slowest car last year, right? But at the start of the season, that Sauber was actually a good point-scoring car. They just didn't maximise it because their pit stops were over 3 to 5 business days long. This is my worry with Racing Bulls. The more that teams start developing and understanding, when upgrades come into play, if Racing Bulls now can't take advantage of the performance that they've got, then they're going to be in big trouble in that midfield pack in the next phase of this season, because they should be on the board and getting good amount of points, and they're just not getting them, and it's because the strategy team has blundered them twice now. So yeah, big problems for Racing Bulls. It's a real shame for them. But that is it for the team-to-team breakdown. In terms of my thoughts for the Japanese Grand Prix, it's going to be interesting because obviously there's going to be a fortnight's break now. There's no race this weekend. It's next weekend now. And it's going to be interesting to see if any teams understand their cars more, if any teams will bring the first batch of upgrades coming into this weekend, or whether they'll wait for the Bahrain Grand Prix to do that. Obviously, it's going to be interesting because it's obviously a lot of high-speed corners around Japan, so teams that don't have performance in the high-speed corners are going to struggle. That's why I personally think going into the weekend, obviously McLaren will be the favourites. I think Ferrari will actually be very good around there. Obviously, like in the middle sector in China, Hamilton was much quicker than the McLarens, and that is a forte of what Japan gives. There's a lot less low-speed corners. You've pretty much only got the hairpin after the 2 Degners and the chicane at the exit of 130R for you to really have slow-speed cornering. The rest of it is medium to high-speed corners. So I feel like Ferrari could be a threat there if they get their car in the right working window and it's set up correctly and is legal at the end of a Grand Prix. That's the one thing. Obviously, Verstappen will be in there as well. I think Mercedes will struggle a lot more in this weekend compared to the others. I think, as we saw it in Melbourne, there was one of the high-speed corners that they were judging. I think it was turn 6, where the Mercedes was 10 kilometers an hour slower through the corner because it just lacks pure downforce. So with the high-speed direction changes, I think it might be a concern. But then again, in China, Mercedes did a brilliant job when I didn't think they would. So, hey-ho, that's what I think of it. But guys, that is going to be it for this episode of the F1 debate. If you guys have enjoyed the video, feel free to drop it a like and subscribe to the channel if you're new around here as well. And I'll catch you guys for the next F1 debate video after the Japanese Grand Prix. But for now, I'm out of here. Take care all. Peace.